Well, you have been listening there to representatives from the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Israel all speak. The two Arab countries' foreign ministers and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This is all ahead of signing a deal to normalise ties. All of this on the south lawn of the White House. And as you can see there, overseen today by a very proud US President Donald Trump. Donald Trump has been describing today's signing of what they're calling these Abraham Accords as the dawn of a new Middle East. And President Trump congratulated all the different parties, and he says that he is optimistic, confident even, that other countries will follow. And then we heard Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also saying that this could potentially end the Arab-Israeli conflict once and for all. Still, though, the Bahraini foreign minister insisting that there is the potential for a two-state solution, that this does take them one step closer. However, Palestinians, as we've been hearing from our correspondents in the West Bank and then also in the protesters in the crowd just outside the White House, saying that they do feel like this is the end of any potential peace process between the Arabs and the Israelis in the Middle East. And that there is a deep and profound sense of betrayal and anger that this is taking place today. Well, it does look like they're about to sit down and sign that deal. Our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett is there on the lawn with them, and we will be speaking to her as this all happens.
The United States, the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, and His Highness, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the United Arab Emirates, will sign a treaty of peace, diplomatic relations, and full normalization. They will each sign 3 copies, one in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. We kindly ask that all guests remain seated for the signing of the documents.
Can you be helpful here in telling me your name?
Well, let's bring in our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, who is standing there on the lawn watching all of this happen as it takes place live now. Kimberly, you were saying earlier this has been regarded as a really important moment, but not necessarily a historic deal. Talk us through the significance of what we're seeing right now.
I think it's significant, and certainly many people will argue that this is historic, given the fact that this is sitting down of regional neighbors who have not sat down recently in front of the White House in this manner. And so this is being heralded, at least by the participants, as historic. It was important to note that all of the leaders seem to call for departure of cynicism, that they're trying to see this as a template for moving forward in a dawn of a new era of peace in the Middle East. Now, notable is that the Palestinians are not present for this in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but even that, we are told that in terms of the agreement, has prevented further annexation of Palestinian land, something that the foreign minister of UAE acknowledged was particularly important. So whether hopeful is that this will allow for other Arab neighbors to also normalize their relations. So that is something that is being celebrated, recognizing that there are still many other nations to join on to this agreement. But in terms of the message that's being sent, I think it's important that to acknowledge that the Israeli leader, speaking in Arabic at one point, saying "Salam alaikum," this is certainly an acknowledgement, an overture, if you will, a reaching out that they say is very important.
Well, Kimberly, when we were speaking earlier, you mentioned that there is more international interest in what's happening today than perhaps domestic interest, that average Americans aren't necessarily watching this super closely. What sort of reaction have we been seeing there, especially in the lead up to this deal, which we knew was going to be signed today?
All guests remain seated for the signing of the documents.
I'm sorry, it's a little bit distracting to hear what you're saying, as I'm also hearing the loudspeaker in my ear. But what I can tell you is happening right now is, of course, the fact that they are in a very momentous occasion, all of these leaders signing these documents. It's important to note that they are being signed in 3 different languages, in English, in Hebrew, and also in Arabic. And that is really significant in terms of the partnership and this recognition that all of the people of Abraham, as you heard one of the speakers saying, now able to move forward to bring stability and prosperity, they say, to the Middle East. Also saying in there that with the Abraham Accords and their signing that, in fact, all Muslims will now be able to go to pray at Al-Aqsa Mosque, of course, the third holiest site for Islam. And this is a significant achievement. And also the fact that they feel that many in the region were held back by old conflicts, particularly the younger generation. So these senior generations now trying to show an example, setting aside some of those conflicts to give the opportunities for not just prosperity, but even scientific achievement, so that the best and the brightest in the region, regardless of religion, regardless of language spoken, will now have that opportunity.
Kimberly, I was asking you earlier, and I know it's very loud there, just around the reaction that you've been seeing from the different political factions in the U.S. How are they regarding this deal?
Well, it's notable that in the midst of this event actually taking place right now, that what they're focusing on is not reaction, but the moment itself. That is what is taking place, and certainly that is what will make it onto the television screens. But there's no question with the coming hours that there will be reaction. We know that there was some cautious optimism by the top House of Representatives leader, Nancy Pelosi, who said that she felt this was an important day, but also a day that Congress will need to scrutinize in terms of future deals with regard to arms sales. And in fact, we know from the Palestinian negotiator that, in fact, I'm just trying to keep an eye about what's going on, keep one ear as I talk to you, that there is a fear that this is an ushering in of an arms race. And there certainly are going to be questions about potential sales of F-35 fighter jets to the UAE. That is one thing that Congress is watching very carefully. But there's also concern that this in some way legitimizes some of the concerns with respect to human rights and the contributions the UAE has played in the conflict with regard to Yemen and U.S. support for that conflict, the Saudi-led conflict there, which, of course, we know the United Nations has called a humanitarian disaster. There's also the pro-democracy movement in the UAE, and whether or not the quashing of that has somehow been given legitimacy in this deal. So there is going to be reflection in the coming days, but certainly, again, these leaders asking that that cynicism be set aside so that they can focus on what they see as the future for the younger generations as heralded through this deal and a template for peace they hope that other Arab nations will sign on to.
Kimberly, you mentioned the arms sales there. There has been a lot of talk of economic and security ties, as well as the practical implications, like being able to go and worship at Al-Aqsa. There has been a lot of speculation around how this might change regional dynamics, and a lot of talk about how this really paints Iran in the region as the kind of mutual enemy of all the groups here. How might this affect foreign policy going forward in the region for all these different countries?
Well, there's some cynicism that, in fact, it doesn't change anything at all, that this is really just a show that, in fact, the posturing against Iran already was in place, that there were already informal exchanges in terms of a united concern about Iran between the UAE and Israel, as well as Bahrain, and that this is just in advance of the election an opportunity to formalize that and give the U.S. president a win that he might need on the foreign policy stage. So many would argue that nothing has changed. Of course, there are others that will view this as a provocation, and that's certainly something that I put forward to Jason Greenblatt in terms of how Iran could react. And they said that the administration sees, in their view, that Iran sees everything as a provocation and that is no reason for them to not move forward. But certainly that is a concern in the U.S. Congress. In fact, it'll be the subject of an upcoming hearing with respect to not only the weapons sales, but how those will be utilized and the U.S. role in that. So you've heard the leaders here today say that the U.S. has a very firm footprint and that it is one that should be recognized. But again, it is always, as it has been in the past and will be in the future, one that is controversial.
Indeed. Kimberly, we're seeing everyone on the balcony there looking very, very happy indeed, and particularly President Trump looking very proud. You mentioned the timing of this, 49 days to the election. Can President Trump expect a boost from this?
It's unlikely that the domestic audience is going to be paying much attention to this. This really has more to do with geopolitics and realignment there. But in terms of foreign policy circles in the United States and in the U.S. Congress, it'll certainly be recognized. It's something that the U.S. president can put in his campaign commercials. But again, it's not a focus of ordinary Americans. What they're concerned about is the economy, kitchen table issues like making sure there's a job, that their children are safe to go back to school in the midst of a pandemic. Those are the issues that will be important. But again, in terms of sort of the larger scope of creating a checklist of wins for this president, certainly this is one that he will add. Whether or not this will win over any new voters is unclear, but certainly it is something the U.S. president felt was important enough to put in advance of the U.S. election as one of his, in his view, foreign policy achievements.
Our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett watching that event for us, that very, very landmark deal being signed on the South Lawn of the White House there. Thank you very much, Kimberly. Well, just outside the White House, protesters have gathered against that deal.
Shame on you! Shame on you!
Palestinian Americans are calling it traitorous, and they say they've been left out of efforts towards peace. Our correspondent Heidi Jo Castro is with those protesters there. Heidi, we were seeing competing protests earlier, clashes almost. Emotions are clearly running high there.
That's right, and you'll notice the Palestinian flag unfurled behind me, namely the one flag missing from the ceremonies we've seen taking place within the White House, and that really encapsulates the sense of betrayal being left aside that these Palestinian American protesters have been expressing to me. They are few, there's a few dozen people here. They're joined by some Jewish allies and other allies, but they certainly have been vocal, now staging a press conference outside of the press house. Earlier, they walked around the block, kept at a wide berth from the proceedings there by police and Secret Service, but there was a few moments of tense friction when they encountered some pro-deal counter-protesters. We'll hear from those folks in a moment, but first, this is what a man told me who is Palestinian American, drove here with his family from Chicago. That's a 12-hour drive to be here, he said, to bear witness to this moment, which he calls a betrayal and a great disappointment.
When our brothers, the Emirates and the Bahrain comes here to sign a peace agreement with Israel, they can also sign a peace agreement with the Palestinian. The Palestinian is a brothers. They deserve to have a peace too, and they deserve to have a live too. They deserve to have to tell Israel, okay, give them some of the just to live peace with you. Without the Palestinian problem to be resolved, there is no peace will be in the Middle East.
I didn't vote for him in 16. I'm definitely voting for him in 2020 because of his awesome stance on Israel. Like, he's the best foreign policy president we've had in generations.
And that last protester, last voice, a counter-protester who was speaking of his newfound support for President Trump, as Kimberly Halkett was saying, that this move just within 2 months of the U.S. elections here may be part of the campaign strategy of President Trump, and at least he's won one new voter there. But certainly on the minds of average Americans here, this has not been front page news here in the U.S., and whether or not this helps move the needle as we near the election in Trump's favor is still to be seen.
Heidi Jo Castro there, just outside the White House in Washington, D.C. for us. Thank you very much, Heidi. Well, Palestinians have also been protesting in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. Our correspondent Nida Ibrahim is there and joins us live from Ramallah. Nida, when we spoke earlier, you mentioned the deep level of anger there. Have people been watching the signing take place?
Not around me. We didn't see people watching it, and we didn't see people posting a lot on social media lately. Namely because many of them have been saying that this is not surprising, that some Arab states are normalizing with Israel, but they weren't expecting that the timing of it would be so close to the American plan that this administration has been pushing for. The U.S. has been trying to get the Palestinians to sign and to agree on the U.S. Mideast peace plan, which Palestinians see as a plan that doesn't meet any of their aspirations for a future state. They feel that the Palestinians here feel that they were betrayed by the Arabs. They feel like this is a failure by the Palestinian diplomacy, and that the Palestinian leadership has lost its regional and Arab allies. Many officials have told us that these two agreements wouldn't have been signed today without the approval of regional powers. So they feel like they stand alone. And many officials have said that this is this today considers that they consider today as a black day, and the death declaration of the Arab Peace Initiative, which calls for the normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab states, but only when Israel ends its occupation of the Palestinian lands.
Well, Nida, we heard the Emirati foreign minister today, ahead of that signing, thank Israel for halting the annexation of Palestinian territories. Is there a belief on the ground there that they will keep their promise, and for how long?
On the contrary, for the Palestinians, they don't really care if there's an announcement of halting annexation, because for them, the Israeli measures on the ground when it comes to house demolitions, when it comes to annexing lands and trying to push Palestinians out of their lands in the occupied West Bank are still ongoing. So even if Israel has delayed its plans to annex parts of the occupied West Bank, business goes as usual when it comes to the actions of the Israeli government in the occupied territory. So for them, really, they didn't gain anything from the UAE's deal with Israel. And they also said that the Bahraini deal didn't give even anything, not even kind of a statement to save face that they did that for the Palestinian people. They don't want anyone to be taking credit or to give them and to show that they did that for the Palestinians. They say, we don't want anyone to speak on our behalf. This is a message we've heard from many protesters in Ramallah today.
Nida, this has clearly also brought a number of the Palestinian factions much closer together. Has this helped with unity there?
There is definitely a move towards unity. Palestinian leaders have been saying that they really have the way forward for them is to go inward. They really have no support among a lot of the Arab countries that they were hoping that they would support them. So they organized the leadership meeting, and it was attended by Hamas and Islamic Jihad officials, and they agreed to renew steps towards the Palestinian reconciliation namely between Fatah and Hamas, but also between the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But it's worth noting that Palestinians who were interviewed in a poll released today, there are around 60 and more than 60% of them do not believe that these reconciliation efforts will be fruitful, namely because it's been more than 13 years on the Palestinian split, and the Palestinians are not had signed so many agreements to reconcile, but they never did.
Nida Ibrahim there for us in the occupied West Bank, live for us in Ramallah. Thanks so much, Nida. Well, earlier I spoke to Majib Zuwairi. He is director of the Gulf Studies Centre at Qatar University, and he explains why this alliance between the UAE, Bahrain and Israel will not benefit the Palestinian cause.
What is the importance of having these relations at this time if there is no benefit to the Palestinians? The Israeli context is coming because of the Palestinian cause. Any Arab countries wanted to have a relation with Israel should be based on basically finding a solution to the Palestinian question. So if this is not the outcome, it's obvious that it is sort of move toward coalition. It is most about it's about survival of this political mess around in the region, where at least the United Arab Emirates was part of it, and Bahrain as well. So I think it comes in a context where they are losing a lot of battles they put themselves in, especially in Yemen, in Libya, and they are trying to find basically victory. And that this applies on Netanyahu, this applies on Donald Trump. All of those parties, they are looking for short-term victory. And the real victim is the Palestinian cause and Palestinian rights.